My name is Daniel Cross, and I haven't seen the morning sun in weeks. Midnight is the only hour that exists for me now. It began with my neighbor, Claire Hensley, the quiet woman in 4B who vanished without a trace. The night she disappeared, I heard the first knock at my door. Since then, time has stopped moving, and something in the dark keeps calling my name. It was exactly midnight when I first heard it. A faint knock at the door, 3 soft raps that seemed too controlled, as though whoever stood there knew I was awake and listening. My eyes shot open, my heart thudding as the sound carried through the quiet of my apartment. I stared at the ceiling, too afraid to move, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But the noise hadn't been a dream. It had been sharp, clear, real. I turned my head toward the clock on my nightstand. The red digits glowed in the dark, fixed at 12 a.m. I held my breath and listened. The silence that followed felt unnatural, too heavy, like the air itself had thickened. I lived alone, in a small apartment at the edge of town. Nobody ever came to visit, and certainly not in the middle of the night. I told myself it was probably the pipes, or maybe someone knocking at a neighbor's door by mistake. Still, a sick feeling gnawed at my stomach. Just when I started to relax, the knock came again. 3 raps, perfectly spaced, perfectly calm. My skin prickled, and I pressed myself deeper into the mattress, gripping the blanket tightly. Whoever was outside seemed to know I was awake. They weren't knocking to announce themselves, they were knocking to be heard, to remind me of their presence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knocking stopped, but I felt no relief. Instead, I became aware of how exposed I was, lying in bed while something unknown lingered just beyond the door. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds, it was impossible to tell. My thoughts raced, and the silence stretched on like a suffocating rope tightening around me. Finally, I turned my eyes back toward the clock. That was when I realized something strange. The glowing red digits that had reassured me moments ago were gone. The clock was completely dark, as though it had been unplugged or drained of power. The entire apartment seemed to lose its faint hum of electricity. I could no longer hear the quiet buzz of the refrigerator or the occasional creak of the heater. My body tensed. Power outages happened, but not like this. The night outside looked the same through my curtained street lights burning as usual, faint beams bleeding into my room. Yet inside, everything was dead. The silence grew even heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had intentionally cut me off, trapping me inside a bubble of stillness. I lay frozen, staring into the dark, listening for any sign of movement. For a long time there was nothing. Then came a sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It wasn't another knock, but rather the lightest scrape like fingernails dragging across wood. It seemed to come from the front door, the very place the knocking had come from. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I buried my face in the pillow, trying to block the sound out. But the scrape came again, longer this time, stretching across the door frame like someone was testing it, drawing invisible lines against the wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing for sleep to take me, wishing to open them again and see daylight pouring into the room. I waited like that for what felt like hours, muscles trembling, my body locked in fear. Eventually, the scraping stopped. I forced myself to look around, desperate for reassurance. Everything seemed normal at first, the faint shape of my dresser, the outline of the door leading to the hallway, the curtains shifting slightly with the draft from the window. But then I saw it. The mirror across from my bed, a tall one I barely paid attention to, seemed darker than it should have been. Instead of reflecting the dim shapes of my room, it looked like a slab of black water, deep and endless. I stared at it, straining my eyes in the low light, my pulse roaring in my ears. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw movement inside it, a ripple, like someone shifting just out of sight. I blinked hard, and the mirror returned to normal, showing only the vague outlines of furniture and shadow. The sudden stillness felt like a cruel trick, the kind that convinces you nothing is wrong only to strike again when your guard drops. I couldn't bring myself to move closer. I couldn't bring myself to check the front door, even though every instinct screamed at me to make sure it was locked. I stayed in bed, rigid, until exhaustion slowly pulled me under. Just before sleep claimed me, I opened my eyes one last time to glance at the nightstand. The clock had come back to life. Its red digits glowed faintly again, but they didn't make sense. The time still read 12 a.m., the same as when I first heard the knock. It hadn't moved forward even by a minute, and that was when I realized something far worse than the knocking, or the scraping, or the silence. Time itself hadn't moved since midnight. I was trapped in the same moment, endlessly circling back to the beginning, as if something was keeping me here. When I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, the last thing I saw was the clock flashing faintly, pulsing in the darkness like a beating heart. The second night came with a weight that pressed down on me long before midnight. All day I had felt uneasy, like I was waiting for something I couldn't avoid. My mind kept replaying the knocks, the silence, the strange darkness of the mirror, and especially the frozen clock. Every time I thought about it, a chill spread through my body. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my nerves were already stretched thin. I told myself I wouldn't go to bed this time. I would stay awake, alert, ready to face whatever returned when the clock struck 12. The hours crawled by. I sat in my bedroom, staring at the door as if sheer willpower could keep it closed. The red glow of the clock on my nightstand burned into my vision. I counted the minutes leading up to midnight, though a part of me wondered if they even mattered. When the numbers shifted from 11:59 to 12 o'clock, I felt my chest tighten, and right on cue, the knocking began. 3 raps. Gentle, deliberate, perfectly timed. My stomach turned to ice. It wasn't the kind of knock someone used when they were desperate to get in. No, it was patient, almost confident, as though whatever stood outside knew it didn't need to rush. I clutched the arms of the chair I was sitting in and forced myself not to move. The knock stopped, but the silence didn't bring relief. That was when I heard its footsteps. Slow, dragging, drawn-out steps that echoed faintly through the hall outside my bedroom. Each sound was followed by a pause, as if whoever or whatever was moving wanted me to count each step. They didn't sound right. They weren't the steady rhythm of a person walking. Instead, there was a scrape, as though bare feet were being pulled across the floor, heavy and reluctant. I pressed my hand over my mouth, terrified that even my breathing would draw attention. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just beyond the thin wooden door of my room. I stared at it, half expecting the knob to turn, but the knob never moved. Instead, the steps began again, slowly pacing back and forth, as though the thing outside was deciding what to do next. When I finally dared to look around, I caught sight of something in the corner of my vision. At first I thought it was just a trick of the dim light, but no, the hallway beyond the crack in the door was darker than it should have been. Much darker. In that darkness I saw a shape, tall and thin, standing unnaturally still. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, but not like any shadow I'd ever seen. It seemed to have weight, depth, substance. It was darker than the surrounding black, an absence of light that felt alive. My eyes burned as I tried to focus on it. The longer I stared, the more wrong it seemed. Its edges rippled like smoke, but its body never moved. A suffocating dread filled my chest, pinning me to the chair. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. The shadow remained, watching me, though it had no eyes, no face, nothing human at all. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it dissolved into nothing. The hallway brightened again, as if the darkness had been peeled away. I blinked several times, shaking, unsure if my mind was breaking under the weight of fear. Relief came like a fragile breath, but it didn't last long. I noticed something new. The floor just outside my door wasn't clean anymore. At first I thought I was seeing stains in the wood, but as I leaned closer I realized they were marks, blackened smudges, scorched into the floorboards. They looked like footprints, but longer, narrower, twisted in a way that no human foot could make. They trailed down the hall, leading toward the front door, burned into the very surface of the wood. My chest tightened as I realized what that meant. Whatever had been there wasn't just in my head. It had weight, it had form, and it had left something behind. My mind raced, desperate to make sense of it. Maybe it was soot. Maybe I was imagining things. But when I rubbed at one of the marks with my sleeve, the black stain didn't fade. It was as if the wood itself had been burned. I backed away, trembling, unable to take my eyes off the trail of footprints. They ended abruptly in front of the door, as though the thing had simply vanished into thin air. I wanted to convince myself that it had left, that it wasn't coming back, but deep down, I knew better. The knocking, the frozen clock, the scraping, the shadow, they weren't random. They were steps in something larger, something unfolding around me. I forced myself back into bed, though my body screamed against it. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, ears straining for the faintest sound. Hours passed, or at least I thought they did, though the clock still read 12 o'clock. My thoughts spiraled, every nerve waiting for the next sign, the next intrusion. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me again. My eyelids grew heavy, though fear clawed at the edges of my mind. Just before I drifted off, my gaze flicked to the hallway one last time. The blackened footprints were still there, etched into the wood, glowing faintly in the dark, as if embers still smoldered within them. On the third night, I didn't even pretend I could sleep. I stayed awake in the living room, pacing from wall to wall, counting the minutes, listening to every creak of the building, every shift of the air. My nerves were shot, my skin crawling with the memory of the scorched footprints and the shadow that had appeared and vanished like smoke. I told myself if I stayed awake, maybe I could catch it, prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Whatever was happening didn't follow the rules of the world I knew. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the apartment thickened. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were drawing closer. My breath came out in small clouds, and when I glanced at the clock, it was already waiting for me. 12 o'clock, glowing bright, unchanged, mocking me. The minute hand never moved. It was still the same moment, stretched thin and endless. I thought maybe this time I would hear the knocks again, or the dragging footsteps, or see the shadow lingering in the hall. But what happened was worse. The sound came not from the door, but from inside my room. A faint rattling like glass quivering on the edge of a shelf. My eyes darted toward the source. It was the mirror, the tall one leaning in the corner, the same one that had looked too dark on the first night. At first it seemed ordinary, reflecting the dim outline of the bed and dresser, but then something shifted. The mirror no longer showed my bedroom. Instead, it opened up into a place I had never seen before, an impossibly long corridor stretching into darkness. Both walls were lined with doors, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one slightly ajar as if waiting to be opened. The air in the reflection was different too, thicker, heavy with shadows that seemed to move on their own. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering, but I couldn't pull my eyes away. The mirror was no longer a piece of furniture, it was a window into somewhere else, somewhere I had no business looking into. The corridor and the reflection seemed alive, shifting faintly, the shadows crawling across the doors as though something unseen was breathing inside them. Then, one of the doors creaked open. Slowly, carefully, as though whatever was behind it was testing the air. My stomach twisted. A pale hand slid out, its skin paper-thin, its fingers impossibly long, curling and dragging against the mirrored surface as though it could feel its way into my world. The sound of those nails scratching the glass sent shivers down my spine, a sound so sharp and real that I felt it inside my bones. The hand pressed harder, leaving faint streaks on the inside of the glass, desperate to push through. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to it, to the way the hand flexed and curled like it belonged to something that knew I was watching. For a heartbeat I swore the glass began to bulge outward, warping under the pressure, as if the mirror itself was thinning, ready to tear. I gasped and stumbled back, finally breaking whatever grip had frozen me in place. I turned my head away, too terrified to look, but the silence that followed was even worse. I forced myself to glance back at the mirror, and to my horror, the corridor was gone. It was just my room again. The bed, the dresser, the faint shadows, everything exactly as it should be. But one detail was wrong. My reflection was missing. The mirror showed the room, but not me. Where I should have been standing was nothing but emptiness, a blank space, as if I had been erased from existence. My hands trembled, and I raised one in front of the mirror to test it. Still nothing. The mirror refused to acknowledge me. I was invisible, absent, like I didn't belong here anymore. A suffocating dread wrapped around me, thicker than before. My heart pounded, sweat stung my eyes, and all I could do was stumble away from the mirror, clutching the wall as though it could anchor me to this world. The idea that I might already be gone, already claimed by whatever lived in that corridor, hollowed me out with terror. I curled onto the bed eventually, my body shaking uncontrollably. I tried not to look at the mirror, but every time my eyes wandered, I saw that empty reflection staring back at me. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed with me lying awake, unable to move, unable to breathe. When exhaustion finally pulled at my eyelids, I let myself drift into a shallow, broken sleep. But even then, I wasn't free. In my dreams, I walked down that endless corridor, doors creaking open on either side, shadows crawling out to follow me. And when I looked over my shoulder, there was no one there at all, not even me. The fourth night began with an unease that was heavier than the others. By now, I almost expected the routine, the knock, the dragging footsteps, the shadow in the hall, the mirror. I sat rigid in my chair, waiting, every nerve raw, my eyes darting to the clock again and again. Midnight was always the threshold, the cursed hour that refused to move. When the digits shifted to 12 o'clock, I braced myself, clutching the arms of the chair, prepared for the sound of knuckles against wood. But nothing came. No knock, no scrape, no footsteps pacing the hallway. The silence that fell across the apartment was thick and unnatural, far worse than the noises that had haunted me before. I strained my ears, desperate for any sound that might remind me the world was still normal, but there was nothing. Not the hum of the refrigerator, not the distant engines of cars outside, not even the faint whir of the heater. The silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was a suffocating presence, swallowing everything alive. I opened my mouth and let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't hear it. My chest rose and fell. I could feel the air leaving my lungs, but it made no sound. Panic surged through me as I covered my ears, then uncovered them, but the silence didn't change. I clapped my hands together as hard as I could, but there was no noise, only the dull vibration in my palms. I screamed, my throat tearing with the effort, but even that came out muted, swallowed before it could leave my body. I stumbled across the room, shaking, grabbing my phone from the nightstand like a lifeline. My fingers trembled as I pressed the power button. The screen lit up, casting a glow across the room, and for a moment, I felt relief. At least this still worked. But then I saw the time on the screen, and my blood ran cold. The digits didn't read 12 o'clock, they read AM. I blinked, thinking my eyes were deceiving me, but the numbers didn't change. I watched them, hoping they would shift forward into something that made sense. They didn't. The time was broken, bent, wrong in a way that made my head spin. A crushing dread pressed into me, and before I could even process it, the phone flickered and went black. I was alone again, trapped in a silence so deep it felt like I was drifting underwater. I backed against the wall, pressing my palms into it as though the solid weight could keep me tethered. The stillness stretched on endlessly. Seconds or minutes impossible to measure without sound, without the ticking of a clock. I stared into the dimness of my apartment, my eyes straining to catch any movement, any flicker of life. That was when I noticed the shadows. They had grown thicker, heavier, stretched longer across the walls than they should have been. At first I thought it was the dim light playing tricks on me. But the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't still. They pulsed faintly, like they were breathing. Some stretched and curled across the ceiling, thin tendrils reaching downward. Others swelled in the corners, bulging shapes that seemed to shift when I blinked. I pressed my back harder into the wall, praying the silence would break, that something would return to normal. But instead, the apartment seemed to grow darker, the air colder, the shadows heavier. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a force, pressing down on me, hollowing everything out. I stumbled toward the window, desperate for proof that the outside world was still there. I yanked the curtain aside and pressed my forehead to the glass. The street outside looked normal, lamps burning, houses lined up, the familiar road stretching into the distance. But even there, no movement, no cars, no rustling trees, no wind. The world itself looked frozen like a picture, still and lifeless. My reflection in the glass caught my attention, and I wished it hadn't. My face looked pale, drawn, but what made me recoil in horror was my mouth. Though I had just been gasping, screaming silently, my reflection's lips were sealed shut. No breath, no sound, no movement at all. I staggered back from the window, shaking violently, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. I wanted to hear something, anything, even the dreaded knock or footsteps, but nothing came. The silence had swallowed the apartment whole, and I was stranded in it, alone, helpless. I sank onto the bed, clutching my chest, trying to convince myself this would pass like the other nights. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't the same. This wasn't just a haunting, it was erasure. Something was peeling away the sounds of the world, one by one, stripping me of everything familiar. As I sat trembling, I noticed the mirror again in the corner. The reflection was dim, warped, but unmistakable. The corridor had returned, faintly visible in the glass. The endless doors stood open in silence, waiting. No sound, no movement, just a void stretching into nothing. I closed my eyes, praying for sleep, praying for escape. But even in that silence I felt something stir. The shadows shifted faintly along the floor, curling closer to the bed, reaching slowly, patiently, as though the silence itself had grown claws. The fifth night came with a sense of inevitability, as though every step I had taken since the first knock had been leading to this. I didn't bother lying in bed this time. I sat in the living room, staring at the front door, my body heavy with exhaustion, my mind buzzing with dread. Every muscle in me trembled, not from surprise anymore, but from the weight of knowing what was about to happen. Midnight was no longer a time on the clock, it was a prison. The air grew colder as the moments crawled by. My breath curled into faint clouds, though I could not hear it, not in the silence that still ruled the apartment. I watched the clock on the wall, and when its face shifted to 12 o'clock, I felt my stomach twist. Right on cue, the knocking began. 3 slow raps, polite, patient, the same rhythm I had heard on the very first night. The sound didn't make me jump this time. Instead, I felt myself sag under its weight, as though it confirmed what I already knew. Whoever was knocking wasn't asking for permission. It wasn't even trying to scare me anymore. It was announcing itself, reminding me that it had always been there, waiting. I stayed seated for a long time, frozen in place, staring at the door. The knocks stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against me until it felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled violently, and yet, for some reason I didn't understand, I stood. My body moved on its own, dragging me toward the door like I was being pulled forward by invisible strings. Each step felt heavier than the last. The floor beneath me groaned softly, though I couldn't hear it, only feel it vibrating faintly under my feet. I reached the door, and before I could touch it, the knocking ceased completely. The silence deepened, absolute, suffocating. And then, slowly, the door creaked open. The hinges moved on their own, groaning into the stillness. But instead of the hallway of my apartment, something else waited on the other side. It was the corridor I had seen in the mirror, the endless passage of doors stretching into blackness, each one slightly ajar, each one waiting like a hungry mouth. The air that spilled through the opening was ice-cold, thick with the scent of dust and rot, heavy with the feeling of something ancient. I wanted to shut the door, to slam it closed and run, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me again, trembling yet obedient, dragging me closer. I stood at the threshold, staring into the corridor, my heart rattling inside my chest. The shadows inside seemed to move with purpose, shifting just out of sight, slithering along the edges of the doors. That was when I saw it. The shadow, the same one that had paced outside my room, the same one that had burned its footprints into the floor. It stood motionless just inside the corridor, taller now, darker, its form sharper against the gloom. In its hands, it clutched something small, something glowing faintly red. My stomach dropped when I recognized it. the broken clock from my nightstand. The digits on the clock were alive again, glowing in the darkness. They didn't read PA or PI, not exactly. They pulsed, flickering back and forth, always returning to the same cursed time, midnight. The steady red glow illuminated the shadow's faceless form, washing the corridor in a sickly light. I felt the truth settle over me like a shroud. Midnight had never passed. I had been trapped in that single moment from the very beginning, caught in its grip like an insect in amber. The days I thought I had lived, the hours I believed had crawled by, they were illusions, fragments stitched together by whatever force held me here. The shadow stepped aside, as if offering me passage, its faceless head tilted slightly, a gesture that felt almost like an invitation. My chest constricted, and yet I found myself leaning forward. Something deep inside me whispered that resistance was pointless, that I had already crossed the threshold in every way but the physical. The corridor yawned open, endless, lined with doors that seemed to pulse with faint movement. I thought I saw pale hands reaching from the cracks, thought I heard a whisper buried somewhere inside the silence. My legs trembled, my body begging to collapse, but instead I took a step forward, one step over the threshold, into the place I had been shown night after night. The moment my foot touched the ground inside, the door behind me slammed shut. The sound should have been deafening, but in that void it was silent, swallowed whole. I spun around, clawing at the wood, but the door was gone. Only another door remained, one of many lining the corridor, identical to all the others. The shadow loomed at my side, the clock still glowing in its hands. Its red digits pulsed one final time, burning into my vision. 12 a.m. And then, without a sound, the shadow vanished. I was left standing alone in the endless hallway, surrounded by doors that all seemed to breathe, to shift, to wait. Behind each one I felt the presence of something vast and hungry, something that had been waiting longer than I could comprehend. I don't know if I am still walking. I don't know if I ever left that corridor. All I know is that midnight never ends. The doors are still waiting, and somewhere, in the silence, I can feel them slowly opening.